We are now live on the CAMCA webinar. People should be joining us for the next couple of minutes. I just want to let everybody know that we will begin promptly at the hour. It's a different hour for everybody on this screen, and we will begin right on schedule. So please click in, settle back, relax, get ready for an exciting session. It is 10 o'clock in the eastern part of the United States, and we are going to begin. Welcome, everybody. I'm Anders Wimbush. Welcome for CAMCA. We are gathered here today to discuss the post-coronavirus pandemic challenges and opportunities for the CAMCA region. And to do so, we've got a wonderful cast of characters, all who will address these issues from different directions. We have with us Sodyq Safoev, the first deputy chairman of the Senate of the Oliy Majlis of Uzbekistan, former Uzbekistan ambassador to the United States, and one of our very favorites. We have above him, I think we probably are all looking at the same thing. We have Svante Cornell, the director of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, who's known to all of you. Below him, we have Michael Sellman, who is the co-CEO of Calatrava Grace. He is in London. Dulguun Baasandavaa is the CEO of BGB Peak LLC. He is in Ulaanbaatar, and he's also a CAMCA fellow. And finally, Andrew Michta is the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center of Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. And he will be speaking in his private capacity, not as a member of any government or any other organization except what he can find in his head. And he's a very smart guy, so I have no doubt at all that it's going to be a very exciting discussion. We are here today to take a look at the interesting developments in the CAMCA region as a result of the coronavirus. And the context of this is that the CAMCA countries lie at the very center of a larger region, which is undergoing great change. And even before this pandemic, most of the region's principal trading partners were wrestling with slow or unresponsive economies. Others had begun realigning largely to advance geopolitical interests. Great power competition was speeding up in some respects and slowing down in others. Central Asians themselves and CAMCA members are looking for a more organic regional identity capable of magnifying their shared history, their cultures, their interests, and the economic frameworks to enhance each of their states' ability to build prosperity through cross-border transactions and political mechanisms to help manage their disagreements efficiently and effectively. So that's the context that we're dealing in. The questions that we want to get at, and I suspect that we're probably going to have more questions than we have answers because the effect of the pandemic is not finished and it still has a long way to play out. But we want to get from this group, how do you understand how the world around CAMCA has changed and how might those changes be reflected within CAMCA itself? Does the pandemic offer any alternative futures that no one is really thinking about or that aren't visible yet or clear? How will the pandemic affect the states around CAMCA, with whom CAMCA has to deal, and what will be the nature of the dynamics that then can be identified in their relationships with one another? Finally, the question is, what should we be paying attention to? What should we be looking at because of this pandemic going forward? Where are the big gaps in our knowledge, and how do we go about filling them? We're going to begin with Svante Cornell. We'll go from Svante to Sodyq Safoev, to Dulguun, to Michael, to Andrew. I'm going to give each of them about 8 or 9 minutes. At the end, I'll circle back, give them each a couple more minutes to reflect on what they've heard from other participants. And then if there are questions coming in through the webinar, we will get to some of those. Svante, set the stage.
Thank you very much, Anders, and thank you very much to everybody who was part of this discussion. We would have very much liked to welcome you in Almaty, Kazakhstan, as was supposed to be the plan. We just hope and we're very certain that we're going to be welcoming you together with the Rumsfeld Foundation and our Kazakh partners a year from now instead. This panel is, of course, very topical, but I would agree with Anders that it is very early to say anything definitive about the implications of this pandemic. So I think I will try to focus on identifying the issues we should be watching for rather than making any bold predictions. Now, of course, the impact of the pandemic, or the context of the situation we find ourselves in, I would say, are both internal and external in nature. And I'll say a few words about the internal to begin with, internal to the region, that is. And I think the first point I would like to note is that so far, although all countries have been hit by this pandemic and the economic consequences of it, at least from the point of view of the pandemic itself, the CAMCA countries have been hit relatively mildly, definitely compared to some countries in the West that have had a much more difficult situation from a public health perspective. We can discuss the reasons for that. Some might be good reasons. I think definitely one important point which we keep making at our institute is that the Central Asian countries, the Caucasus countries, Mongolia, and to some extent Afghanistan, are much more than just former republics of the Soviet Union. They are real states. They are real countries with functioning governing institutions. And I think many countries have shown the state capacity to deal with this type of pandemic. Definitely there are differences. Some countries are hit worse than others. Armenia and Tajikistan are examples. But countries like Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan appear to have handled the pandemic relatively well. Obviously, the main issue might not be only the public health situation, but the economic and political impact. In terms of economic implications, I think it's important to remember that this crisis is not happening in a vacuum. In a way, we have a reprise of what happened 5 years ago when the oil price collapsed in 2015. This is still fresh in the minds of countries in the region, and it affected everybody. It obviously affected oil producers who were directly dependent on income from hydrocarbons. It also affected everybody else, especially those countries with large migrant populations, labor migrant populations in Russia. So it essentially affected almost everybody. And we're really talking about very serious impact, including devaluations of up to 40% or more of the currency across the CAMCA region. So this is important in today's context for several reasons. One, because the regional economies have recently been through very difficult times. They began to recover and in some cases to prosper. But I think more importantly, the 2015 crisis led several countries to begin serious reforms, not only to diversify their economies, but to make them more conducive to foreign investment, And that involved also political reforms in everything from the management of the state to anti-corruption and so forth. Senator Safoev, I'm sure, will speak more about Uzbekistan, which has been the most brilliant star of reform across the region. But we have seen reform agendas in several other countries, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, most obviously. But I think this also means that if the present crisis had happened in the absence of 2015, which in a way prepared and forced many of the countries to take steps to make themselves more resilient, perhaps the shock would have been worse than it is at present. Now, one point I would like to highlight looking at the region as a whole is the level of regional cooperation and solidarity that we have seen. Perhaps most importantly, the efforts by Uzbekistan, to some extent Kazakhstan, to come to the assistance of their neighbors that were hit by supply disruptions that threaten their economies and livelihoods, I think is very significant. And that in a way cues us into the outside picture and what has been happening with the traditional great powers with interest in Central Asia. And here I think my point is going to be fairly blunt, namely that the e-CAMCA region has not really cannot really expect very much from the traditional great powers or the non-traditional great powers for that matter, but that the positive stories are really from within the region itself and cooperation within the region. Now, we look at China, which of course was the source of this pandemic, and on a global level, the government in Beijing has behaved rather aggressively in general, even since before the pandemic really. This has not particularly been an issue with Central Asian countries, but it is definitely the case that the international behavior of the Chinese government has been noted across Central Asia and is something that is very much in the minds of people everywhere. Russia, of course, had an opportunity, I would say, maybe another opportunity to show that the cooperative institutions that Russia has been promoting, most prominently the Eurasian Economic Union, possessed a strong value not only to Russia, but to the member states of these institutions. I would say that it's pretty clear by now that Russia wasted that opportunity and pursued policies that really ignored the interests of its partners and focused very much on its own narrow interests. The oil price that Russia started with the Saudi Arabians is an example of this, which had serious implications for the e-CAMCA economies. With the pandemic, we also see how Russia sent aid to the US and China and others in what was mainly publicity stunts. But the assistance that Russia provided to members of its own Russian-led institutions was very limited compared to that. Of course, Russia shut its borders to Central Asian migrants, which was another hit to the e-CAMCA economies. And I think it may not be surprising for many of us that Russia acted in a way that really ignored the interests of its partners. But it's still noteworthy, especially in a situation where Russia has been campaigning very hard to get those countries that are not part of the Eurasian Economic Union to be part of it, to join this union. And I think everybody is watching what's in it for us, so to speak, to join institutions that Russia is proposing and that is supposed to be in the interest of all the members. Now, I would be amiss if I did not mention that the West hasn't covered itself with glory either. Obviously, the West has been very hardly hit, both Europe and the United States, by the pandemic. And I think that it was already the case that the West had already lost a lot of the attractiveness it may have had a decade or two ago in the e-CAMCA region. And of course, the chaos in the United States and the displays of discord and closed borders within the European Union have really done nothing to improve the position of Western countries in the region. Whether aid programs that may be in the pipeline can make a dent in this, I think, remains to be seen. So it seems to me, again, that for the e-CAMCA region as a whole, I would quote, some of us know Edward Luttwak, who has put it in the following way, that great powers tend to be autistic. They tend to be ignorant of the needs of their partners or clients. And I think this crisis has definitely made that point very clearly. And the only thing that is a positive in this story so far, as I mentioned, is a level of consultation and cooperation among the e-CAMCA countries. Now, this has been most strongly the case within Central Asia, where we have seen a dramatic improvement in regional cooperation in recent years. But I think there is, on the level of e-CAMCA as a whole, very much an opportunity to broaden this by developing the Trans-Caspian connections, which I know that both Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and even to some extent Turkmenistan have been doing with Georgia and Azerbaijan, by improving the Central Asia-Afghanistan relation, which Uzbekistan has been working on, as well as others, and by, of course, involving Mongolia more greatly in many cooperative ventures across the region. I think I'll stop here, Anders. I'll just make one quick plug for a paper that we're about to release by two of our Rumsfeld fellows, Farukh Irnazarov and Roman Vakulchuk, about the scenarios for the economic situation in the region post-pandemic. This will be released and I think circulated to everybody who is taking part in these discussions and attending these events within a week from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Svante. A very good setting of the table. You've raised a lot of issues. Sodyq Safoev, you sit right in the middle of all of this. You see it churning around you. Tell us what your observations are. What has the pandemic done in the middle of the CAMCA region and around it that has caught your attention?
Thank you, Anders. Good morning to you in Washington, in the United States. Good evening to those who join us from the majority of CAMCA region. And thank you very much for inviting me to join this distinguished audience and panel and to try to respond to this question, pandemic, its consequences, and impact on the global development. First of all, we should realize and admit that the world has not faced a global disaster of non-military nature for the last 100 years, which the COVID-19 pandemic turned out to be. No comparison to any crisis in 9/11 or 2008 financial crisis, because never before billions of people were locked down, isolated, state borders shut, and the world economy practically paralyzed. Let me make some observation which surprised me, or to my mind might describe the current situation in the world. First of all, if I'm not mistaken, first time during the past 100 years, such a crisis did not lead to the consolidation among the great powers who combined their efforts in confronting such a challenge. Moreover, even long-term allies were somehow distanciated from each other. It's something new. Something new is that United States did not show up as a global leader, and even more surprisingly for me is that nobody expected that from them. It's something new, nobody demanded from them. Absolutely astonishing that the developed countries, as we used to call them, first world countries, not were, let's say, most successful in confronting the pandemic. Moreover, some newly independent countries, as Svante just mentioned, were much more successful. And I think that it's worth to be noted. International organization, it's not something new and it's not surprised me, but we should know that international organizations, if not failed, but were not most successful in confronting this disaster due to the lack of institutional, financial, legal levers in there. And it's interesting that diplomacy kept silence during this pandemic, and the international life was rather quiet, meaning that the agenda for diplomacy and foreign policy was not clearly defined this time. Conclusions from this, some observations. I think that we are dealing now with not just biological pandemic. It's beyond. It's geopolitical, financial, economic, and it's only, we might say that COVID-19 is not the main cause of current problem. It's maybe exacerbated some of them. I believe that many problems of today's world, the problems are rooted much deeper, and they started before the pandemic arose. I think that, as usual, biosphere gives us a signal that something is wrong in this world, with that the human being empowered with the new technology, science, nevertheless failed to respond to the invisible enemy, this virus. I think that we should look to the international infrastructure or organization of the current world. To my mind, the main contradiction is that contradiction between the globalization and the absence of legal infrastructure for governing, ruling the transnational, above national forces born due to the globalization. It doesn't mean that I'm, let's say, arguing for deglobalization. It's impossible. I do believe that globalization is a process which cannot be stopped, ignored, or postponed for the time being. And that's why I do believe that connectivity and synergy of combining efforts of countries, states, societies, civil society, NGOs, parliaments is essential for creating the dialogue, and as a function of the dialogue, trust. I think that the main problem of current world is the absence of trust, and that's why the international community failed to create kind of a world protocol in confronting such a disease. And it's one again demonstrated the vulnerability of very powerful human being of 21st century. And lastly, I'd like to tell you that what you, Anders, invited us to think what we should expect from the post-crisis world. Let me start with pointing what we should avoid from the post-crisis world. We should avoid to go to the with atavistic step saying that democracy failed during the pandemic. It's wrong. And moreover, I do believe that only due to the democratic reforms done, for instance, in Uzbekistan, country and society were able to consolidate both private and public resources, mobilize them, and combining the efforts of the NGOs and government somehow created the fact that Uzbekistan was avoided the worst scenario in pandemic, and moreover, even to afford some help to the 11 foreign countries, including the countries of the European Union. And that's why I think that reforms are matter, and we should know that national statehood and good governance principle is very important for the next steps. Maybe I will stop here and make, since I still have some time, and I hope that, Anders, you will allow me to use this time, which I never used during my next responses to possible questions and the reaction to the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sodyq. Wonderful points, provocative, and I'm sure we're going to hear more of on most of those issues as we go along, and you will indeed have more time to expand your thinking. Dulguun, you have been at the upper limits of the CAMCA region. What does the pandemic look like from there? What's its impact? How does it radiate in Mongolia and around you in ways that we should be paying attention to?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A warm greeting from Mongolia to all of you. Mongolia is one of the countries that didn't don't have coronavirus inside the country. All the cases we have is about 197 as of today, all imported from other countries. What I mean by is that we transported our citizens from other countries, and some of them indeed had coronavirus, and about 197, there are over 80 people recovered already. But everyday activity is going as usual, except there are a number of restrictions put by the government. The impact of the pandemic is, the major impact is, I believe, is economic, because so far our country, the trade, especially the export, was reduced by 40%, and it will not going to recover because we can't keep up the volume as compared to last year. Also, the price of the commodities fallen quite a bit compared to last year. So the major impact will be economic, and exports will not going to recover. And if you look at the foreign direct investment, not only in Mongolia, but in the region, all of those foreign direct investments in the region has fallen to a quite low level. In Mongolia, we have the foreign direct investment at least reduced by over 50%. So I don't know when it's going to recover, both the export level as well as foreign direct investment. So if we wait for the vaccinations, and if the majority of the people get the immunity against the disease, it will at least take a year or more. Therefore, the impact of the coronavirus in terms of economic will have a long-term effect in not just in Mongolia, but in the region. That's how I see it. According to the World Bank, the pandemic will push about 40 to 60 million people into extreme poverty. I truly hope that quite a low level, quite a few of those people will be in the region, but there is already sign that in Mongolia the poverty might be increasing because of lack of jobs and because lack of social security, especially in those target groups. What I see is that the commodity prices might not recover in coming year or longer. That's going to really affect the external balances of the CAMCA region countries, because CAMCA region countries are mostly commodity exporters, including Mongolia. And if you look at the Economist publication that brought up in 3 weeks ago, there is a case about economic financial strength, and Mongolia ranks 59th out of 66. As for Kazakhstan, they ranks 36th out of 66 countries. And the best among the CAMCA region is Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan ranks 23rd out of 66 countries. What I mean is that as the exports fall, as the foreign direct investments fall into CAMCA region, our external balances are kind of into a deficit, into a negative, and that makes our economies more vulnerable. And that means we need to borrow from other countries or international organizations. Mongolia already borrowed $100 million from IMF and over $200 million from ADB. But that's not enough to overcome the economic difficulties during this pandemic. Therefore, we need more external borrowing. That makes our foreign debt increase quite a bit. I don't know how high the foreign debt will increase at this moment, but definitely it's going to make our country more vulnerable, because either this loans will come from international organizations or from our neighbors such as China. And I believe many of those CAMCA countries borrowed quite a bit, some of them quite heavily from China. And that I'm afraid make Chinese leverage higher over any policies, also any areas, not just economic, in those CAMCA regional countries. That's the economic side of it. As for the political impact, I believe this pandemic impact is also negative. We have only 1 week of campaigning left for a parliament election. Mongolia have parliamentary election every 4 years, and we are already in the second week of the campaigning, and we have only 1 week left. So what's happening in Mongolia is that the current government are using kind of making the pandemic as a reason, as an excuse to put more restriction on the gatherings, on the freedom of speech, and all those areas which democracy kind of prevails in this in our society. So I believe the election is quite unusual compared to other previous 6 elections in Mongolia. And to conclude, we don't know at this moment the negative impacts, how long it will last and how big it's going to be, both in terms of economy and in terms of politics, at least how I see it in Mongolia. And if the economic impact, the negative impact is more as we go forward, then I'm afraid it might lead to more political instability in a number of countries, especially those are more vulnerable to foreign debt, also heavily reliant on outside external factors. Yeah.
Thank you, Dulguun. A very depressing picture you've painted, but I suspect with a great deal of accuracy. Michael Sellman, you watch the economies of this region pretty carefully. What did you just hear that you weren't already thinking, and how should we be thinking about this?
Thank you, Anders. Unfortunately, Dulguun is mostly right. And what I want to do here is discuss 3 things: the economic impact so far on the region, as you suggested, notions of recovery and what the impacts are potentially on regional relations, and then a broader international strategy of the CAMCA states, and then a few things to watch going forward, as you pointed out. So on the economy, what's bad? Dulguun is certainly right. There's been some bad GDP data. Mongolia, bad news. Afghanistan and Kazakhstan's growth projections have turned sharply negative, from positive 3% or so to a 3% contraction for the year. Oil prices, another issue, they don't help. At $40 oil, you're looking at most countries' budgets being set to substantially higher oil values. Kazakhstan, in its case, at $55, which leaves a major budget gap. Currency devaluation was an important point made, which has not helped the economies. Something less appreciated, perhaps, is underfunded healthcare systems. And a word of caution here: in good times, individual patients, all of us, shoulder an outsized portion of costs in an underfunded healthcare system, like in Central Asia. Obviously, during a public health crisis like the one we're experiencing now, the overall costs go up, impacting the individual more. So to give you some data, the world average for the amount of total healthcare costs that individuals bear the burden of is about 18%. In the United States, it's 11%. Kazakhstan, 30%. And in Afghanistan, it's shockingly almost 80% of healthcare costs. So you can imagine a major negative impact and a point of fear when going through a situation like this. Another thing that's important that we alluded to from Svante on migration, remittance payments, we need to pay very close attention to. These remittance payments drive much of Central Asia's economy. Since the onset of the pandemic, we've seen a global reduction by 20% in remittance payments. Remittance payments from Russia alone have dropped by 50% in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And Uzbekistan, I want you to keep in mind, remittance payments from Russia are 10% of the economy. Total remittance payments are 15% of the economy. And to give you a bit of context, the entire industrial sector there is about 18% of GDP. So we're talking about a major impact that we should pay attention to. Of course, there's some things that are less bad. There's other GDP data that's in fact encouraging. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, though they've been on growth tears, have had forecasts revised to still positive, nearly 2%, even after the impact here. A bright light for Uzbekistan is also the notion of gold, which accounts for 50% of its exports, and as we know, is a safe haven during times of panic and has rallied 10 to 15% since the start of this crisis, benefiting the economy. More qualitatively and politically, you can imagine that regimes that have had historically isolationist perspectives and policies, like much of Central Asia, are not necessarily as integrated in the global marketplace and therefore could suffer the brunt of global trade impact, perhaps more nimbly. And secondly, a strong regime, as we see many of the governments in Central Asia, has the ability to act quickly and enforce lockdowns. So pivoting to the recovery and some strategic shifts, I think there are 4 trends that I wanted to bring up. The first is the most obvious and perhaps the least important. Unpredictable and often strict travel and trade guidelines could motivate further regional cooperation when it becomes trickier to deal with the world farther afield. The second one that is a bit more niche and is a topic that is near and dear to our company's heart is affordable housing and the adoption of international building codes. And I want to focus for a minute on Uzbekistan because I think it has a chance to be a real leader here. Since the death of first President Karimov, President Mirziyoyev has promised a much more open and responsive government, and the long neglected housing sector has become a priority. We've seen him remove barriers to citizens moving from the countryside to the city by abolishing the Propiska, or the Soviet system of urban registration. He's worked with the Asian Development Bank to arrange funding for hundreds of thousands of new homes. In 2019, the Uzbek Mortgage Refinance Company was established to help set up opportunities for people to obtain housing credit. And then on top of this reform orientation, you had an unparalleled urgency that came in the form of a sort of double catastrophe. On the one hand, the COVID-19 pandemic, and secondly, on May 1st, the large earthen Sardoba Dam in northern Uzbekistan burst, destroying tens of thousands of homes and forcing the evacuation of 70,000 people. Hundreds of millions of dollars were allocated as emergency funding, and President Mirziyoyev launched a broadside against what he judged to be the low quality of building work, and said by 2021, all government-funded building projects would have to meet international standards. So why is this a shift? What does it mean? I think if done correctly, reforms in affordable housing and their associated construction methods can in many ways serve as proxies for social stability. They can prove the efficacy of political reform, and they can manifest as cooperation with foreign experts. And this can offer a roadmap for countries in the region suffering the same problems. And because he's on the panel, I have to offer compliments to Senator Safoev. President Mirziyoyev is not a soloist here. And very senior officials in the Uzbek government, like Senator Safoev, have been active and enlightened partners on this point and appreciate the need to drive forward these reforms. Third trend, and I think this one is a bit of a departure, Svante, from what you said about the great powers and what e-CAMCA should not expect from them. I think that we should pay attention to increased US involvement in this region to counter the influence of China and Russia. So first of all, as Dulguun suggested, everyone knows China's funding for the Belt and Road Initiative. What is interesting is that the new entrant to the contest is the newly constituted United States International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC. Though this was signed into law in the fall of 2018, it didn't officially start operations until December 20th of last year. It was essentially through the BUILD Act, the combination of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, our United States Development Credit Authority, and USAID. So this is a massive $60 billion mechanism to, as the law stated, quote, offer an alternative to the state-directed investments by authoritarian governments. Very thinly veiled broadside against the Chinese participants. So what do I think is going to happen? I think this Sino-American engagement will play across the world stage, but a major focus will be Central Asia. And it supports what I think is an increasingly popular thesis that the world is re-entering a Kissingerian notion of realpolitik. There's a preservation of equilibrium in several regions of the world that the United States will have to participate in. And I think Central Asia is going to be one of the battlegrounds. And as you see the DFC ramping up its capabilities, this will be a major, major focus. And it leads me to the last theme, which is directly related, Afghanistan. We've seen recently from the United States policy, however complicated and poorly articulated it may be, a supposed peace deal with the Taliban and a drawdown of military forces under the Trump administration. So what do we have? We have a target here, a military conflict zone in Afghanistan where the United States has put $130-some billion in assisting in reconstruction efforts. Troops are leaving, and we have a peace deal. So you can be sure that the development apparatus using corporate proxies, et cetera, will kick into high gear as the United States pays attention to the resources that's poured into that region. And I think that we're going to see the Central Asian countries as both waypoints and intermediaries play a critical role there. So to conclude, the things to watch, let's look at remittance payments, as I said, very important to see when they start moving back up, which would also suggest migration shifts. Affordable housing policies, as suggested, could really illustrate a chance for countries like Uzbekistan to trailblaze. US economic presence through the use of the DFC, and then the Afghan story. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Very provocative, very thoughtful. Andrew Michta, you are a big picture guy who looks at geopolitics over a very, very broad canvas. What are you drawing from this conversation that suggests to you that the tectonic plates might be shifting, that realignments might be taking place, or that we have some surprises in front of us?
Thank you, Anders. And again, let me lead by saying that I'm speaking in my private capacity as an analyst, and my views do not represent the policy or position of the Defense Department or the Marshall Center. I was listening to this conversation, really fascinating conversation, and thank you for having me engage in this. And I kept on thinking of what the resurgence of great power competition is going to mean for the region. Let me just try to put it in a broader context right now. We are at an inflection point when it comes to US strategy. As you know, we have a new national security strategy since 2017, which will be updated soon. And we have a new national defense strategy. There's an unclassified 12-pager that then Secretary Mattis released in 2018. The key deliverable from this dramatic change is that not only are we in effect at the tail end of this very optimistic view of globalization that was going to create China as a responsible stakeholder in the system, whereby export-driven modernization and the access to our resources in terms of technology, education, and so forth was going to transform China, was going to democratize China. Today, we clearly know that was delusional probably from the start, and I'm not saying this lightly. I've been arguing against that approach to China for the past 2 decades. What we see instead is a rise of a geostrategically assertive China that is now confronting the United States, not only in the Asia Pacific, but also increasingly across Eurasia, and here Central Asia, the whole e-CAMCA region is going to be absolutely pivotal. And quite frankly, China is now becoming a power in Europe. It is not yet a European power, but it is a power in Europe. The 3 decades of our economic policy vis-a-vis China, remember, not just the ability of China to join the World Trade Organization as a developing nation, not only this unprecedented access to our technology and our research centers. In fact, you know, we have about 1 million graduate foreign students coming to the US annually. Of those, 370,000 have been Chinese graduate students. The Chinese have been commissioning research and, quite frankly, stealing a large portion of the technology and the knowledge base. There was a Congressional Research Service study about, I think about a year ago, which indicated that 1 in 5 of Western companies doing business in China has been extorted for intellectual property for market access. I'm bringing this up to simply show the dramatic difference of the previous round of great power competition with the Soviet Union. And you and I remember this quite well, where COCOM restrictions, the kind of very hard-nosed approach to any technology transfer, forced the Russians to rely on their own technology while they were reverse engineering a number of systems and so forth. We have essentially given the Chinese the ability to flatten that curve and to come much more closely in terms of their manufacturing and design and production capacities. So that's one side of it. The other one of this equation that is critical for the region is Russia. Russia has been a revisionist power essentially since the arrival of Vladimir Putin. And I would argue that Russia and China are in effect aligned. And I won't quibble, is it an alliance, is it an alignment, but they're aligned in the larger global strategic objectives. For the Chinese, for the Russians, it is to revise the post-Cold War settlement. And for the Chinese, I would argue it is to displace the United States from the center of global power and essentially remake what we know as the open, liberal, democratic international order. So in this round of great power competition, and that's going to put an incredible amount of pressure on the region, the United States and its allies, the democratic world, if you will, are now confronting not 1, but 2 near-peer competitors in many areas. And we're doing this after about 2 decades of incessant warfare, some of it in the theater that we're talking about, that has both depleted our resources and has restructured our military more towards that type of competition. I want to add a third element to this discussion, which I think is absolutely critical, because we've been looking at longer trends in how this rise of China and the resurgence of Russia was going to play itself out. And that has tremendous geostrategic implications, I would argue, not just in terms of individual actors and individual states in the region, but also in terms of how we look at the relative relationship between maritime and land domains. I would posit that China is in the process, through its Belt and Road Initiative, through its 17+1, about 50 Schengen type, Shenzhou type economic zones across the region. China is trying to build a secure supply system that it can try to defend using its military, and in effect reverse the maritime to land domain relationship, making Europe, I'm here currently working in Europe, into not so much a kind of gateway for the transatlantic community into Eurasia, but the tail end of the Chinese controlled supply chain. What China is also trying to do is push the United States out to the periphery of the Western Pacific. And you see this in the developments of Chinese Navy, the kind of tenders for the aircraft carriers that are out there. And most importantly, the Chinese are also probing into the Arctic. The region, e-CAMCA is right smack at the center of those corridors and passages that China is currently building. Last point I want to make. The pandemic has been absolutely a perfect storm when it comes to this larger, already fluid geostrategic situation. The most important thing is that it has shortened, it has compressed the kind of projections that we have had on power transition, on the relative rise of China in different regions, relative rise or decline of Russia. If you look at this triple hit where we got hit by the pandemic, then we in effect had sheltering in place across the Western democratic community, which created unprecedented dislocations in our systems. We know how to deal with, we've lived through a depression, we've lived through recessions, we've never lived through a suppression of economic activity. We've never ground a multi-trillion-dollar economy like the American economy to a halt. And you add to this the kind of instability that you now see across Western democracies. This creates a tremendous opportunity, I would argue, for China to move away from this good citizen paradigm and become much more predatory and much more demanding and much more aggressive in what it is doing. I expect that there will be ever more pressure on China to dominate the region. Afghanistan finds itself in a difficult situation. Michael mentioned the attempt to reach a sort of peace agreement with the Taliban. I think our domestic politics may also play a significant part in the future developments in Afghanistan. You remember we're in the electoral season. In short, I expect much more instability, the timelines to be much shorter, and CAMCA to find itself right in the eye of the storm. And I'll stop here and turn it over to you, Anders.
Thank you, Andrew. Again, very provocative, very thoughtful. You've raised lots of issues. Each of you has raised a lot of issues. Now, what I want to do is give each of you a chance to respond to what you have heard from others and make additional points. And Svante, you are going to have the first bite of the apple. Sodyq, you will be next. So Svante, you're up.
Thank you, Anders. Well, I've been listening very carefully, I hope, and I've enjoyed this conversation. Obviously, I would agree with most that has been spoken here. The only point that I would qualify might be the issue of a China-Russia alignment. I would agree that this is happening on a global level, where the Chinese and the Russians definitely have a joint effort in terms of undermining the influence of the United States and the transatlantic community, if it still exists more broadly. But looking at this, the CAMCA region in particular, there are elements of alignment and cooperation, which we see in SCO, for example. There are also elements that suggest the opposite. I mean, for example, I would argue that the Eurasian Economic Union was in part a Hail Mary in order to prevent the wholesale Chinese takeover of Central Asia from a Russian perspective. I would also point out that the Belt and Road Initiative does not really feature Russia that prominently. In fact, increasingly, if you look at the evolution of BRI maps over time, it is significant to what extent it goes south of Russia rather than through Russia, even though Russia sometimes is the most direct route. Now, my point rather than that, I think those are things we can discuss, but I think if you're sitting in Central Asia, and perhaps Senator Safoev, you may agree with me or disagree, I would get a little bit concerned about this discussion of great power competition, not because I would disagree with what's happening, but because it would be about me in a way. Great power competition is about something. Great power competition happens in the global scale, and maritime issues are all very nice and so on. But in the case of the CAMCA region, these are very real issues with potentially very significant implications for countries here. We can just take the example of what happened to Kyrgyzstan in the past decade or two, where I think that the very serious internal turmoil that country went through from 2005 onward cannot be separated from the geopolitical competition between Russia and the United States, hosting military bases from both countries, and President Bakiyev in particular being put in this position where he was first forced or compelled to close an American base, and then he went back on that promise, and he basically lost his job and is now sitting in Minsk somewhere as a result of this. I'm just making that illustration to make the point about the stakes for CAMCA countries. Mongolia, perhaps most openly, most directly, is sandwiched between Russia and China from this great power competition. Now, having said that, I think I would actually join with what Michael Sellman said in terms of making a note of the US new strategy. Michael talked about the DFC component of it, as well as the European Union's new strategy for Central Asia, because I think what will be key for the Central Asian countries, I think, is two things. First, to find breathing room and CAMCA countries more broadly, what allows us freedom of maneuver. For the Western countries, or India, or Turkey, or Iran, to come barge in and engage in traditional 19th century style realpolitik is not necessarily what they want to see. What they want to find is external powers that are supportive of their priorities. And with their priorities happens to be right now the development of regional cooperation. And I think there's a very good reason why we see regional cooperation within the CAMCA region, particularly in Central Asia, at a time of great power competition. And that's because I think countries in the region realize that if we don't band together and try to organize our region, somebody else is going to do it for us, and we're going to lose our agency in the worst case scenario. So in that sense, I think the focus of our discussions before the pandemic, after the pandemic, it's going to continue to come back to what increases the agency of the CAMCA countries, what increases their ability to decide for themselves about their future. And that's where I think for a lot of reasons, there is a natural proclivity, a natural alignment of interest between the United States and Central Asian countries. They need the presence of outside powers, but we need these outside powers to be there in order to enrich, if you will, an atmosphere dominated by the big giants near them, but also in such a way that it doesn't make their relations with those big powers more acrimonious, but it improves their freedom of maneuver without necessarily making it more conflictual. And I think that's going to be a very difficult balance for the United States and for the Europeans, Indians, and others to walk, especially if our relations with the Chinese in particular get worse, as they are. But I think we should keep in mind how the Central Asians, the Mongolians, and the countries in the Caucasus look at this issue as we develop policies. And I think the issues that Michael mentioned that are supporting economic development in a more sustainable way, for example, than the Chinese are a very good way of doing that.
Senator Safoev.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anders. First of all, I'd like to just express my appreciation to Michael, who made my job much more easier, because his picture of the situation in Central Asia, and specifically in Uzbekistan, I completely share with your point, Michael. Thank you very much, and I think that your analysis is very good. I fully agree that the problem is not over yet. The pandemic is not over, and we still should fight against pandemic and coronavirus spreading. The threat of spreading coronavirus still exists, and that's why perhaps it would be premature to say that Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, were successful in fighting. Let's wait for a while. Let's continue to fight and continue to work. However, I think there is a slight moment of optimism in regard to Central Asian countries. First of all, I think that, again, let me state that they were relatively good in dealing with coronavirus and economic consequences of the coronavirus. As Michael correctly said, the economy of Uzbekistan will grow, of course, not as much as in previous year, but still is positive, 2%. However, the main problem, the diminishing the inflow of investment, and as a consequence of that, lower economic growth, the diminishing the remittance from abroad, of course, will impact. And of course, decline of the price of energy, as well as let's say, the huge problem of tourism, the service industry in our countries will impact. We expect more unemployment, of course, and that's why country needs more inflow of the capital. There is no, let's say, shortage of supply of the credit lines and technical assistance to countries like Uzbekistan. The main point is how to use them, because it's easy to get the money today with the World Bank, IMF, Asian Bank, European Bank. The point is how, and the foreign debt of Uzbekistan increased during the recent years. It's not a problem. There is countries with, let's say, more burden of the foreign debt than Uzbekistan, was, if I'm not mistaken today, 30% of the GDP foreign debt. The point is how to make efficient use of this money, and I hope that new government of Uzbekistan, who comprise from the well-educated people who worked in foreign banks, will deal with it properly. I don't think that geopolitics of Central Asia, the CAMCA region, will change dramatically. After all the main actors will remain with their own agenda. However, I would, Svante, add one very important point. You should not consider Central Asian countries, especially such countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, as a passive subjects of the great game today. Today, they're different. They're more active participant and object of this, if you would define as a game. And I'd like to also to add that to be sober analysis, we should add that there is one more player in this game. It's radical Islam. We should never underestimate the role of this phenomenon and the possible influence to the development in Central Asia, at least. Maybe it's not acute for Mongolia or South Caucasus, but in Central Asia, we should always be aware that the influence of radical political Islam is, which might undermine the political and economic modernization and progress of these countries. I'd like once again to stress that main challenge for the countries of CAMCA region is transportation and connectivity. That's why Belt and Road Initiative of China is in the interest of Central Asian countries if it will serve to the creating the network of transportation connecting CAMCA region with the world markets. I think that creation of if you noticed, a couple of weeks ago, triangle meeting between the representatives of United States, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan took place, and the very important, to my mind, strategic agreement was signed about the building railroad connecting Central Asia via Trans-Afghan corridor down to the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf. I think that it will dramatically change geopolitics and geoeconomics of CAMCA region if it will take place. The countries of CAMCA need to demonopolize the network of the railroad connecting region with the world. It should be not associated only with north or or east. It must be real network connecting, first of all, with such regions like Europe, Gulf, and the Near East. I think that's very important for us. To conclude, I think that Central Asian countries will avoid some disaster scenario. I agree with Dulguun and Michael that due to the structure and history, of course, there will be huge problems, but there will be no disaster. And what they need now is expand their connectivity to the world, Europe, West, East, Southeast, and I think that it's a matter for them of surviving not only in context of pandemic, but in a long-term strategy. It's, as many times was correctly pointed by Fred Starr and other distinguished scholars, the main factor of progress in Central Asia is its connectivity, openness. And it's not only about the routes and transportation, it's beyond, it's openness to ideas, culture, interdependency. Thank you.
Thank you, Sodyq. Dulguun.
Yes, very informative discussion, everybody, and I agree with many points, especially on the economic front. The countries are affected. All the countries are affected, but affected in a bit differently. For example, some of the sectors, such as tourism, is basically affected almost 100% in Mongolia. And I think it's pretty much the same in many of the countries. When the pandemic first started in China, ADB first reported that those countries with a heavy dependence on China will be worse off through channels of tourism as well as commodity exports. And Mongolia ranked among the top among the countries that affected quite badly. About 31% of all tourists were coming from China, and Mongolia exported almost 90% of its commodities to China. But that situation changed significantly in March and April as the pandemic spread almost to all countries. And what I'm trying to say is that those countries that are much better off are not necessarily were basically integrated with the world economy. Mongolia is quite a bit integrated, and that's why our economy kind of shrunk 10% in the first quarter. And the second is that I don't think many of the great powers are in position to help other countries, and that's the reason why our own governments should be more prepared, because if this pandemic is causing pain to all countries. Before, if it was regional crisis, then outside countries will come or outside organizations will come. But this is a different crisis, and that's why we have to kind of put ourselves in a position so that we are the first responders to this pandemic on our own. The third point I'd like to make is that, as Michael Sellman said, there is a U.S. organization, DFC, that has $60 billion. The $60 billion might not be enough to overcome this pandemic and for the CAMCA countries or the countries that's United States is trying to build better relation with. On the other hand, IMF can. IMF is the lender of last resort, and they have $1 trillion. And that's what the director of IMF said. They will are ready to spend $1 trillion to overcome this pandemic. And that's a huge resource. If we use that resource effectively, then it will help a lot of countries, and it will help to reduce poverty as much as possible during this crisis. That's what I believe personally. And the third is, it's a bit uncertain when this pandemic will end, but when the pandemic ends, many countries will be in a different shape. What I mean is by that is that those countries are better prepared, that has higher economic resources, will have less pain during the pandemic. And when the pandemic is over, there will be more new fields the companies of those countries can explore to. let me try to make it more clear. For example, in Mongolia, tourism sector is badly affected. I'm not sure how many of those companies in the tourism sector will survive after a year or after a year and a half. If half of those companies survive, then the other companies go bankrupt. That means there will be a market. Mongolia is a small country, but that will apply to many countries. Those that supports their private sector with their financial resources, they will recover much faster than the other countries, because those companies will survive and they will expand to other regions and other countries' markets because they survived. And many of those companies in the developing world, including CAMCA region, I think, might not survive because our countries don't have that much financial resources. And it's not just we don't have financial resources, we also have quite a bit of foreign debt, and our limit how high we can borrow is kind of almost to the ceiling, and that's kind of a bad sign that we might not have enough resources to keep those companies running, to prepare those companies for the time when the pandemic is over. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dulguun. Michael Sellman.
Thank you. I think two themes to grab onto here from a lot of very good material. Andrew, you had talked a bit more in detail about the great power competition and why it's different today than it was in the heady days of the Cold War. You mentioned the theft of technology. I think that's true. I think it is different, but what I do believe is that the West still has the upper hand in both trust and quality. And I think we need to leverage this. And that's all the more reason that the DFC, if it deploys its resources well with the right partners, can wield an outsized effect. I think the United States and Europe has a group of private sector enterprises that do a lot of things really, really well. That takes us to the money aspect. And I think it's true what Senator Safoev said, getting money in the form of aid or otherwise is not really the problem. There's a lot of it. Dulguun makes the point too. $1 trillion from the IMF dwarfs the DFC. But it's on us to, and I say us, meaning a US company or a European company or US and European policymakers, to articulate a persuasive narrative about why not only the money we have will be deployed more efficiently, but why it's frankly better. It's the right kind of partnership money. And I think that's the key message we need to offer. On the last point of transportation, Senator Safoev, you mentioned the critical need for transportation infrastructure in the region. Not only do I agree with you, but I think it's one of the obvious next steps from the Afghanistan conversation. You yourself have a very potentially useful border with that country where the United States has so much interest, and you also happen to have very good rail and very fast trains. So your point about utilizing that transportation network for regional benefits is very strong and could certainly attract the interest of those foreign powers that are beginning to partner in this new concept of great power conquest in the region, competition.
Thank you, Michael. Andrew, it's back to you. We're down to our last few minutes. Take us a little further along.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate great comments and a truly great informed discussion. I wanted to piggyback a bit on what Michael said in his final comments just before me. You know, the cliche, never waste a crisis. There is a growing pressure, there's growing political pressure, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, in Japan, to decouple at least portions of the supply chains that we have now in China. Anders knows that I've written calling for hard decoupling on a number of issues that we've been talking about, but we have movement at the legislative side. We've got Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Cotton putting in bills that would require reduction of our dependence on China for our supplies. I think Cotton is talking about banning US pharmaceuticals from relying on Chinese sources and requiring accurate labeling and so forth. I think Japanese are putting something like $2.2 billion to help onshore their companies again. That process will be difficult, but I think regardless of the extent to which it will play itself out, and the Chinese are doing whatever they can to preserve investment in manufacturing their countries. But what most of the observers who are rational about this are waking up to is the need to replace this excessively centralized supply network chain that we have now discovered during the pandemic is disadvantaging us with regional diffuse supply chains with redundancy built in. And Michael spoke also about the good money as opposed to the other kind of funding and financing that's coming in. I think the region may have an opportunity here. And again, I will leave it to the experts from the region to tell me how this could be played. But I think there will be an opportunity in the coming months as we're perhaps entering into the second wave of the pandemic or exiting from it or finally dealing with the medical side of the issues. I do not believe there will be a returning to the status quo ante, where China will continue to suck in major portions of investment and the manufacturing capability. And if the issues that we have heard raised here, such as transportation networks, connectivity, can be effectively addressed, I think there's an opportunity for the region to benefit from this move towards regionalized, diffuse manufacturing chains with redundancies built in, and especially with countries that are cooperating with the United States, with the European Union, not just because of the business interests, but also because of shared interests and values. So I'll conclude by saying let's keep our eyes wide open, not just for how to control the negative impact of this COVID pandemic, but also what potential new avenues for opportunities, both economic opportunities and strategic cooperation, I think that we're going to see emerging. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I hope that our viewers have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Let me thank our panel, Svante Cornell, Sodyq Safoev, Dulguun Baasandavaa, Michael Sellman, Andrew Michta for a very stimulating session. And let me also thank the Rumsfeld Foundation and e-CAMCA for allowing us to do this. I hope you have all enjoyed it as much as I have. Everybody have a very pleasant day. Thank you.